Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming, and a special thanks to Matan Stauber for coming and staying up late to join us on the Hangout. So Matan is an interactive designer and developer from Tel Aviv, and he created an awesome visualization called Histography.io. We get a lot of visualizations of our data, but this one was especially awesome. So we asked Matan to come and sort of talk us through how he envisioned and implemented this visualization. Last time I checked, it has won 14 different awards across the internet. So that's really fantastic. So thanks again, Matan, and please take it away.
Thank you for having me, and hi everyone. So yeah, my name is Matan, and I'm a graphic designer from Tel Aviv. I graduated from Bezalel Academy of Art and Design in Jerusalem, and Histography was my final project there. It was created a couple of months ago, and I'll kind of walk with you through the process of creating it. The final projects, at least where I study, are usually 4 months, and you can do basically everything. But the time is 4 months to do it, and I had all kind of ideas, and one of them was I thought about redesigning Wikipedia. This was one of the ideas, and as I try to expand this idea and think what could be the features of redesigning Wikipedia. One of them was this idea of placing all of Wikipedia over a timeline. But the thing is, when you place Wikipedia over a timeline, you're getting everything from the Big Bang to events that happened this week. So basically, Wikipedia on timeline is timeline of the entire history from the beginning till today. And as I thought about it, I understood that this is a project by itself, this concept of timeline of the entire history, and I fell in love with the idea. So I'll go to the presentation. All right. So what's the first thing you do when you have an idea like this? You Google it. So I searched for timeline of the entire history, and I was sure I'm going to find all kind of stuff, and I didn't. By the way, do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
All right. So I thought I'm going to find all kind of projects, and I didn't. I couldn't find anything. So I was excited because I felt that this is an uncharted territory on the one side, and on the other, I figured that I was scared a little bit. I thought that maybe there's a reason why I couldn't find any timelines of the entire history. But I was a student, and I was bold, and I said I'm going to do it anyway. And I started mapping all the timelines that I could find on the internet. So I'll walk with you over very shortly on some of them. This is our basic model, like the standard model of timelines, the horizontal one with the beginning and an end, and all the events and times and years are distributed horizontal on the timeline. And this is the most common one. It's very, very common. This is his sibling, the vertical timeline. It's exactly the same, but vertical. And it doesn't really matter if we're seeing tweets, history of tweets, or...
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're having some AV difficulties with the slides.
Yeah, Matan, in the sound check, you were able to share your browser, but we can't see your browser right now. We just see the keynote.
That's better, right?
No, I wanted you to see the keynote. You don't see the presentation?
Okay. Now
you see it?
Okay.
All right. So this was what I call the standard model, the horizontal one, and this is the vertical one. and it doesn't matter if I'm showing if it's timeline of Twitter or if it's Disney Princess. It's always the same principle. Some more interesting projects on the internet. This is one by the Guardian, which is timeline of the Arab Spring divided by countries, and you can kind of explore through the timeline. And what is great about this one is it's a timeline and you can see events on it, but it's also infographic. So for example, now I have lots of blue events. I can learn something about, without going to the events, I know something about the period. So when this came out, there was all kind of stuff. Like every good design, they started lots of design like that. So we had all kind of copies of that. Another project, not all of them are successful, that was by the Wall Street Journal, which said, all right, so let's explore timeline as well, but this time they did it as a roller coaster where you can travel through the timeline, little rocky travel, but we can go over. So we can ride up and then down with the graph. This is actually the first timeline, the first known timeline at least, which shows Napoleon conquest. So he tried to conquest Moscow, and the brown timeline is the way toward Moscow, and the black one is the way back. And it's also infographic, so you can see when it's thinner, the size of the timeline represents the amount of soldiers, the live soldiers. So you can see it becoming thinner on the way back. And this is kind of another idea of timeline that doesn't have to be straight. It can be round with all kind of shapes. This is geological times.
I'm sorry, we're still the slides. Oh, I'm just looking at the Twitter slide.
Oh, I'm way past that.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. What if you could do that every time you change a slide, whatever you just did?
Yeah,
maybe the full screen. Let's
full
now.
screen would be very helpful, I think.
No, not. Can you see it now?
So I see the path of protest slide.
Yeah. And when I'm doing full screen, you're losing me?
Yeah, we're not seeing you enter present mode or full screen mode.
All right, so I won't go there. So this is the one that I showed about what the Guardian created.
That's working.
So you can. All right, so yeah, so you can see it moving through the timeline, and you can see areas with. And suddenly lots of blue dots means more international response. So we can get some infographic perspective of the timeline. So this is copies of that, and this is another one that I showed by the Wall Street Journal. And this is the one I said about Napoleon. And something that I usually like to do when I'm designing, especially for browser, is I usually try to search for inspiration outside the web, outside the browser. So, for example, galleries and exhibition is a great place for inspiration. So you can find all kind of ideas of how to approach timelines. So again, back to my project, I said I want to create a timeline of the entire history, which is 14 billion years. But the thing is, when you're creating, let's go to the basic model of timeline, the one I showed in the beginning. So the middle should be 7 billion years ago, and almost next to the end, we still have 10 million years ago, which doesn't really leave a lot of space for modern time, which means that all modern history is a dot in the timeline of the entire history. So the idea that I had in mind is I looked at maps for inspiration. And I said that when we look at the map, we can see it from, we can see the continent, we can see the entire globes, but then we can zoom in to very specific areas, and we can see roads, and we can see small towns. And I thought that maybe I could implement this kind of logic into timeline. This is a project that was created in the 90s, but this was kind of my first idea. A timeline where you can zoom in and zoom out to different periods. I think that something that I didn't understood at the time, I understood that there is a disproportion of time, and I understood that you have to zoom in and zoom out, but I didn't understood how big, how far was the disproportion. And I want to show you a project that someone created very recently, I think a couple of weeks ago, that shows it very well. So, so in this visualization, they said, all right, so what if the entire time of Earth was from the East Coast to the West Coast? This was the timeline. And then they starting going over the timeline and they're saying, all right, so this is where the moon first created. This is where the first rocks created. But when they get to human history, they have to zoom in to a street level. So now this is where Columbus first discovered America. So you can kind of get the sense of how tiny is the entire human history regarding, this is only the history of Earth, and I wanted even more. I wanted the entire history of everything. But so I said I'd create a timeline where you can zoom in and zoom out, and I tried all kind of ideas and attempts. And then I found this one, which I really liked, and I said, maybe I'll create a three-dimensional timeline where you can pick every point you want and you can zoom into it. So I kind of imagine it like babushka dolls, where you can always have one inside of it. So exactly like the maps, I said, you will pick an area and you'll zoom into it and you will find a timeline inside the timeline. And I really like this concept, and I started designing, and I had tried to add visuals to that. And then I said I wanted to be infographic as well. Like I saw the one that that the Guardian created, and I wanted this to be infographic as well. Not only timeline with event, but something that you can learn something more than that. And I wanted this project to work as well. I wrote at the time, I wrote a script that scans Wikipedia for events and take them out and collect events from Wikipedia. And I said, all right, I have areas in time where I know there's lots of events, and I have areas where there's very little amount of events, and maybe I can represent it in some way. So I tried maybe by colors, where I said areas with lots of events will be lighter, areas with very little will be darker, and I tried different versions of that. Then I said maybe size like this or like this. Maybe I have many of them, maybe they're breaking up, maybe by opacity. So I did all kind of attempts, but it didn't really felt in error to the design. And especially when you're doing infographics, you can't have infographics that is too complicated. It makes the viewers needs to learn, need to understand too much. It has to be inherent to the design, something that comes very, very easy very native to the design, and I couldn't figure this out. And in the same time, there was other problem with the three-dimensional. Some was it was very difficult to read, but one other major problem was the idea of understanding where you are at the timeline. So right now you're seeing some kind of timeline where you can zoom in and zoom out, and it says 21st century. But if I remove the 21st century, we will have no idea in where are we. We'll have no sense of navigation. And again, I was looking at maps for inspiration, but the thing is about maps is when you look at a map, you can very easily know where you are. You know if you're looking at continent or you're looking at cities, if you're looking at streets, and it's come very native to us. And in this design, it didn't. And I think something that designers usually have, and myself included, is we can fall in love in our design. And it's very easy to let design go. And it's important to stop and review what you created, and sometimes say goodbye to it. And I knew that the problem that this design had could not be solved. And this was, I was kind of in the middle of the final project, and I wasn't sure if it's still even possible to create timeline of the entire history or not. And I remember I said to myself, take 3 days. Either you can come up with a new design, or you leave this concept and you'll do something else for final project. And in these 3 days, I realized something which I think is significant. I realized that the core of my project is the historic events. I'm collecting them from Wikipedia. I had around 15,000 events, and the events were the core of the project, and not this three-dimensional line. And then I asked myself, why am I creating a line at all? And I realized that even all of the inspiration that I'm looking at always had a timeline, they always had a line into them. And then I said, maybe there's no need for a line. Maybe, and I'll show you now the first sketch that I had for the new concept, and I said, maybe I should focus on the dots, on the events. Maybe I should show all of the events as dots. When you move your mouse over a dot, it will be bigger, but I'll show the events and not the time. So it will still work the same. It will be, let's say, in this screen, so the right side will be, I don't know, 500, and the left side will be 200. So it's still a timeline, but the focus is on the events themselves. And I kept designing it, and I said, all right, so it's still divided to periods, and you can still zoom in to a period. It will work the same, but I'll show all of the events. And the moment that I did this switch, it solved everything, because now it's suddenly infographic. You can see areas with lots of dots, areas with very little. You can understand something about what you're looking at, and it's very easy. It's much more easier to understand where you are, because you're zooming into the dots. They'll all become bigger. So I was excited. I felt that all my problems were suddenly solved. So I kept making different designs, and so you can see here, this is, all right, so whenever a designer, whenever we do working with actual information, if it's big data or it's just infographic, there's always a gap between the way we imagine the data to the way the data really looks like. So this is how I imagine the data. I imagine a very soft gradient. You can see on the right side, there's lots of events, and on the left, I said, all right, so we're going back in time, there's much less. And then for the first time, I had enough events from Wikipedia, and I first created the first script. This is how the data actually looks like. So you can see it's very different than how I imagine it. It's not a soft gradual gradient. It looks very different. But I said, all right, I wasn't afraid of that, and I said, let's put a UI on that. So you can see it's still divided into periods. I can select each period and I'll zoom into it. And I can pick the events and it'll grow bigger. So that was still the concept. And part of it was I said that because I'm getting them from Wikipedia, I have different topics. So for example, I can see maybe just the timeline of inventions or just the timeline of wars. So this concept began to evolve. In the same time, I was searching for how to represent the dots, how to represent the particles. If it's circle, if it's square, there were dozens like that in search of the perfect dot. And this is, for example, timeline with x's. But there was still a big problem because it's very clear that the right side, you can see much more dots, much more events. But the other part of the timeline kind of look the same. It's really difficult to know where you have more, where you have less. So that's a bad infographic. And at the time, I was looking at sound waves. And I said, what is sound wave? Sound wave is basically amount over time when you think of it. So so I wanted to use that. And this is the same data, only using sound waves, not floating around, but with a structure. So immediately it became so much clearer. You can see exactly where you have more events in history and where you have very little. And the concept was always the same. You can zoom into whatever period you want, and there's another period inside of it. So I tried, and I kept designing with different colors, and I stopped and I said, all right, I like the way that the direction that this is going, but what you're seeing now is around 500 years. It's timelines of 500 years. But the problem started happening when we zooming out. This is, for example, timeline of 10,000 years. This is timeline of the entire human history. So it's, as you can see, it's still divided into periods. The massive period, the biggest one, which is most of the screen, is the Stone Age. And then we have the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. And you can see the Renaissance is in the right side, it's cutted. And if you see the tiny line after the Renaissance, this is the rest of the modern history. So this is how tiny is the modern history compared to even human history. And the idea was you pick the period you want, and it was even impossible to click because it was so small. And I knew that I had a problem. And now it's very clear what it is, but at the time it wasn't clear. And it was near the end of the final project, and I remember for around a month I would wake up every morning and I hated the project. And I would work on it until night, and I went to sleep hating the project as well. And I remember I talked to professors and these other designer friends, and there wasn't an answer, and it wasn't clear to me. Maybe it couldn't be done. Maybe there's no way to create timeline of everything, and or maybe it's just a big project I didn't know. And then one day, and I remember it so vividly because it was an important day for me. I was riding the bus and I realized why I don't like the project. And immediately when I understood that, I knew what I had to do. I understood that the concept of maps could not work when you have such a massive disproportion of time. And then I knew what I was supposed to do. I had this idea of creating a controller or a range slider where you can select of all history and you can pick exactly the periods that you want to watch. And the events, the dot will fly around by the period that you selected. So for example, you can choose to watch a single year, a decade, millions of years, hundreds of years, thousands or millions, or maybe the entire history. So I'll show you the way this concept works. So as you can see, I have the bar on the end of the page, and I can select every kind of period that I want, and the historic event will fly and arrange themselves by that. So for example, I can decide I want to watch the entire history, or I can watch 500 years or 1,000 of years. I can zoom in to a specific period or a specific year. And when I went out of the bus and I ran to my apartment and I quickly programmed something, and I remember for the first time it felt fun. And that's important, I think, when you're doing UI. It's important to create an enjoyable experience. For the first time, it felt like that. And the fact that
stopped updating again. Sorry.
Well,
should the slides be updating?
No. No.
Sorry, it was such a good moment. It was such a good moment in the talk.
Wait. So can you see it now?
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So again, in the bottom of the screen, I can change and I can move the timeline, and the events will fly and arrange themselves in the screen, so I can decide to watch the entire history, or I can watch thousands of years, or I can zoom in to a decade or to a single year. And because I'm not relying on selecting a period, then you can see above the slider, you can see the list of periods. So I can look at many of them or a single one. And if I want to go to a specific one, let's say I want to go to the industrial age, I can click on it, and I will immediately see just the industrial age. So the way that the slider works is, again, if the slider will be the entire history with jumping the same way, we will just move by millions of years. So I said no, because I'm creating a controller, the sensibility of the controller can change. So I can start moving by billion of years, and then by hundreds of years, by single years. And later I created that gradually. So notice when I'm moving the slider, I'm moving by billions, and then million of years, and then by thousand, by hundreds of years, and I can go to, and later it's becoming so sensible. The sensitivity grows so much that I can speak specific years. I can decide I want 75, for example. So like the concept at the beginning, every dot is an event, and when I move my cursor over event, it grows. In every time I go to a period, the system automatically recommend on events, but I can open whatever event I want. If there's an article in Wikipedia, I can read the article. If there's a video on YouTube, I can watch the video. If I had better internet, I could watch the video. And I could do this for every event. So on the left side, you can see the list of categories. And when I change the period, you can see them rearranging themselves. So now I'm in a period where there's more written literature than wars. But if I change it, you can see music. Suddenly, there's more events in music. And when I move my finger over a category, I can see just timeline of literature or music or wars, and I can decide to compare them. For example, I can decide to compare wars and music. And I can see only them, or I can compare every category to every category. So this is histography, basically. There's another part of it, but I'll show it very quickly. It's editorial stories, which was chosen, and it allows me, it's a different timeline. It allows me to go back, to move back in time. Yeah, so now I'm seeing when bacteria first evolved, or first dinosaurs. Yeah, so this is another part of it. And that's it, that's histography.
Awesome.
So if you have any questions.
Guillaume, did you want to ask the question? Ask it anyway. I'm interested, actually. I'd like to hear his answer.
Hello. Yes. Hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really interesting to see the making of your project and to hear the stages that you went through, both for the project and and emotionally. I had a question about how you handled the disproportion that you mentioned, with most of the events being at the end of the scale. So you said that you addressed that by having the sensitivity of the slider change. So is that using a logarithmic scale or not? And if not, did you consider using such a scale?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the first version of it was I manually created jumps. So I said from this point to this point, move by millions. By this point to this point, move by thousands. After that, I sat with a mathematician friend of mine, and we wrote an algorithm that made it work much smoother.
Thank you.
Yes, I agree with Guillaume. Thank you. That was interesting. Oh, and we have a question from the Hangout.
Hi. Yeah. I'm curious how, like, you have the nice taxonomy of events, war versus music versus whatever. It's simple and it's nice, and I'm wondering, how did you get that from the Wikipedia data?
That's a great question. In Wikipedia, there's something called timelines of Wikipedia. I'm guessing that you know it better than I, but and in the timelines of Wikipedia, there's basically it's a list of lists. So you have a list of wars and list of inventions. So that is the categories I'm using. So my crawler basically goes over that list and scans for events. So if the event is under category of wars, then we consider it as wars. It's funny because there's some areas where you can see events that are in two categories that repeat themselves. But mostly it's fine most of the time.
So I have a question, actually. How important do you think it is for your design to be able to code, or at least be comfortable working with data?
That's a fair question. I think it's important. I don't think this project could have been created without the ability to develop, to write code. And more than that, I don't think that a designer that would work with a developer could create a project like that. Because when you're doing data visualization, you have to design while coding. And you have to look at the code through visual eye, so that's important. I mean, most things, most UIs, most interface, it's fine. You can be a designer and you can work with developers. But I think when working with big data, or maybe data in general, there's certain things that you can do only if you can do both of them. And you can see, I think in the presentation and the process that I went through, the way that I had an idea and I could immediately create it, develop it, and see it changing. And I think that's important. I think there's not enough designers that can do code as well, and there should be more.
Yeah, you definitely. I was just taking notes for some folks on my team who couldn't be here, and I think you said data never looks like the way you want it to. I think that was a really interesting and honest comment. Stuck with me.
Yeah. You always imagine what you want to imagine. You imagine the data the way you visually want to see it. And then you find out the data is completely different. It's nothing like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to sort of think on a micro level of like a Wikipedia article. There's so much variation in the length, the sections, the pictures, or the images. It's interesting to try to think of sort of a data-driven approach rather than thinking of an article, trying to think of sort of representative articles. Anyway, got me thinking.
Thank you so much for coming and doing this talk. I think we're done with questions, so we're going to end the Hangout. Really appreciate it, and we'll follow up with any questions that come later by email.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.